Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed we do. Lots of big stories breaking this morning. We are taking a look at the very latest out of Ukraine and some new, pretty stunning comments from Biden, again, on the subject of Taiwan. He said unequivocally the U.S. would commit troops to defend Taiwan in the event that they were attacked, and the White House, again, walked it back. This has happened several times at this point, and it continues to be extremely distressing. Also, new questions about whether, if Democrats hold on to the House, whether Pelosi will continue to be the Speaker of the House or whether she will remain the leader of the Democratic Party in the House if they lose control. So that is very interesting. We have some new polling we want to break down for you that is interesting with regards to the midterms and also in terms of the ongoing realignments between the two parties. Stunningly wrong reporting from the New York Times about this Patagonia donation and specifically the tax treatment of it. They went out of their way to say this was totally different from this other massive political gift that happened to come from a right-wing billionaire. Well, it turns out actually they did it in almost exactly the same manner and got caught just completely, I mean, forget about the bias, like they just got it wrong. So we'll break all of that down for you. And CNN, our friends over there, making some very big moves, reshuffling their lineup. Don Lemon getting kicked off of his primetime show, getting moved to the morning, swearing that it's definitely not a demotion.
We'll get into it.
We'll talk about all of that. And we also have update from Saagar on TikTok, update from me on the rail strike. Was it averted? Are we still facing a showdown? And all of that.
All right, let's get to the show.
Indeed.
Ukraine. This is one of the most important things we often talk about here. There's, things going on in politics, day-to-day, polling, etc. But probably the most important thing that we all try to avoid is a nuclear exchange. So anytime that there's an update or news on the nuclear front, I think that generally should be the leading thing that we start with. And that's exactly what happened. President Biden sitting down with 60 Minutes. There's a lot of stuff in the show that we'll talk about today with regards to that. But in my opinion, the most important one was whenever Scott Pelley actually asked President Biden about fears that Putin was feeling embarrassed and may ramp up his military campaign in Ukraine, and especially what would the U.S. response be and the Western allied response be to any sort of chemical or nuclear or biological attack? Here's what President Biden had to say.
As Ukraine succeeds on the battlefield, Vladimir Putin is becoming embarrassed and pushed into a corner. And I wonder, Mr. President, what you would say to him if he is considering using chemical or tactical nuclear weapons.
Don't. It will change the face of war unlike anything since World War II.
And the consequences of that would be what? What would the U.S. response be?
You think I would tell you if I knew exactly what it would be? Of course I'm not going to tell you. It'll be consequential. They'll become more of a pariah in the world than they ever have been, and depending on the extent of what they do will determine what response would occur.
It would be consequential, an important line being drawn there by the president, especially as things on the ground in Ukraine changing up. At the same time, though, not everything is as hawkish as some might believe. And this is always a strange thing with Biden. On the one hand, he, has basically shipped Ukraine almost everything that they want. We've passed like billions and billions. They want 15 more billion on top of the 40 billion that we've already sent to Ukraine. He's like, nothing without Ukraine first, all of that. But then behind the scenes, apparently he's having a real spat right now with Zelensky. So let's put this up there, which is that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government is making a major campaign to hawks in the US media and on Congress to ship them long-range missile systems, long-range guided missile systems specifically, because Ukraine wants new options for striking Crimea. And I talked about this previously, which is that Biden, however, has concluded that it would be seen as a, quote, major provocation by the Ukrainians, and especially on behalf of the United States, if we were to specifically provide them weapons so that they could strike deeper into Crimea. And obviously the reason why that's important is that, of course, Ukraine considers Crimea part of Ukraine. However, the Russians annexed it, according to them, in 2014. They see it as sovereign Russian territory. So, obviously it's all in the eyes of the beholder as to what exactly a provocation is or means. And apparently it seems that U.S. intel and Biden specifically see this as something that could really push push things in the wrong direction,
Yeah.
Krystal. So it's fascinating to kind of see Biden's own red lines as to like what he will test and what he won't.
Yeah, and of course, we always take, New York Times or any mainstream reporting with a grain of salt.
Yeah, who
but
knows?
it was a really fascinating look at the debates that are unfolding inside of the administration, and may very well have been leaked by, a hawk, a general, or someone.
Certainly that is the case.
Who wants to try to pressure him
right.
and show like, oh, you're not doing everything
Yes.
you could do to support Ukraine. Biden, according to the story, keeps telling his aides, we're trying to avoid World War III. So good to see that he has that in mind as a concern. Because the bottom line is the missiles, the longer range missiles that Ukraine is requesting right now, I mean, it's very hard to really characterize them as just defensive aid. It's very hard to avoid the implication that, yes, Zelensky swears up and down, of course he wouldn't strike inside Russia, but these would be capable of striking inside of Russia. And, I don't think that anyone can really trust that in the heat of war, if things got desperate, that there might be some escalation on that front. And even if there's not, how would Putin read this, this latest escalation from us providing these longer range weapons? What they said is they feel so far that they have succeeded at, quote, boiling the frog, meaning that if we had started out of the gates with all of the aid and the intelligence sharing and everything that we're doing in this war now, where it is effectively a proxy war and Putin is, the conversation in Russia is very much like we are at war with the US and with NATO. If we had started with all of that, it would have been much more provocative. Putin would have responded likely in a much more aggressive manner. But because we built up step by step by step without taking any huge leaps in terms of escalation, that their view is we have succeeded at boiling the frog. So that's kind of Biden's goal, at least as presented by this article. With regards to his comments on, use of nuclear weapons by Russia and what would be the response, Biden said something there that was interesting. He said, well, it kind of depends on what exactly they do. And what he seems to be referring to there is deepening concern within the administration that is Putin and the Russians, have more losses and then he gets more desperate. And this is something we talked about from the beginning of the war, this idea of gambling for resurrection, that he may have his hand forced and take more sort of outrageous actions, whether it is use of what they call this tactical nukes, or whether it's something like hitting supply lines or, targeting government buildings in Kyiv. But what they're concerned about is that he might detonate some sort of nuclear weapon not in Ukraine, but like a test. And so then when he says, it kind of depends on what Putin ultimately does, those are the sorts of scenarios that they're thinking through. It sort of reminds me of before Russia invaded Ukraine. Remember, we used to joke about Biden was like, well, maybe if Putin does like the just the tip invasion, that's kind of what he's referring to here is like the just the tip nuclear weapon detonation, which I'm not sure that such a thing is really possible. It's a kind of all or nothing scenario. So always important to remember what the stakes ultimately here are and how grave and how serious they are.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even a nuclear test like what you're discussing would be a tremendously escalatory event. As I recall, I don't believe that Russia has like above ground tested a nuclear weapon since the days of the Soviet Union. I'm pretty sure. I could be completely wrong on that. But that's part of the reason why whenever North Korea would do those, nuclear tests like inside of a mountain or would freak out. Not only from radiation, but it's like that's exactly how we got to the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1963. And there's a reason that we all signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and all of that because it was literal utter madness that was happening here. I don't know exactly what's on the table. However, with Putin, I mean, look, we should take the guy seriously. He's got his back against the corner. We have no idea exactly what he's going to do. Obviously, domestically more precarious in Moscow than probably at any time in his presidency. And, he's signaling to the Ukrainians, let's put this up there, at his most recent conference in Uzbekistan, in Samarkand. Here's what he says, quote, Putin warns Ukraine, the war can get more serious. Speaking, he said the invasion was a necessary step to prevent what he said was a Western plot to break Russia apart. And here's exactly what he said, quote, the Kiev authorities announced that they have launched and are conducting an active counteroffensive. Well, we'll see how it develops, how it ends up. he said with a grin and warned things can get more serious. Specifically, recently the Russian armed forces have inflicted a couple of sensitive blows. Let's assume they're a warning. If the situation continues to develop like this, the situation will be more serious. Obviously, casting that. So look, I mean, there's dangerous stakes here in the war. It doesn't all necessarily stop at the conventional conflict that we're seeing right there on the ground. And all the rhetoric, I mean, yes, Biden did respond to this as a result of a question. However, I have to believe that with all of the environment kind of as it is, with the New York Times discussing this, Putin saying things more serious, that the concern about this is very, very high. And actually, I also found a very interesting quote, which is Colin Kahl. He's a Secretary of Defense for Policy, very close to President Biden. He used to be his foreign policy advisor. I've spoken with him a little bit in the past. He gave a statement specifically to the Times, which gave credence to this, quote, Ukraine's success on the battlefield could cause Russia to feel backed into a corner. That is something we must remain mindful of.
Yes.
That is directly from the Secretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon, one of the most important positions in national security, and someone who I know has the absolute ear of the president and worked for him for a long time when in the Obama administration. So that gives us a little bit of a view into where they're thinking and like what exactly their thought process is right now.
I mean, just ask yourself the question, are they gonna let themselves just lose? Or are they going to escalate?
Right.
Because, I mean, right now they are sustaining significant battlefield losses. Obviously, we'll have an update for you on the very latest. But they also are getting hurt economically.
And humiliated in the eyes of the world.
Yes,
I mean, that probably matters more than anything, honestly.
That's very true. I mean, as gas prices have fallen, all of the coverage we did earlier about how, like, the sanctions regime isn't really hurting Russia that much, that is not the case as much anymore, because as gas prices have fallen, that means they're getting a lot less into their treasury and it's becoming a lot more difficult to sustain. At the same time, European governments are starting to get their acts together in terms of like backstopping their own population, making so they can get through the winter. Russia has already kind of blown their wad in terms of their own economic warfare against Europe. So even on that front, things are getting increasingly difficult, as well as energy prices have been consistently falling. So yeah, just ask yourself, do you think that Putin is just gonna kind of stay the course, even as they're being defeated on a variety of fronts? And the pressure that he's getting domestically, and I think it's really important that we just continue to underscore this, isn't from the doves, it's from the hawks. It's from the people who are saying, you aren't doing enough, you aren't going far enough. We need to strike those government buildings, we need to disrupt the supply lines, we need to have full-scale mobilization and conscription so that we can have an full-on assault. So that's the pressure that's coming domestically, not to end the war. So that's, I think, always important context to keep in mind. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.